Well, the Prime Minister has dismissed claims of Australia ramping up its spying efforts against Beijing. The Global Times has accused Australia of waging an intensifying espionage offensive by sending spies to China and monitoring Chinese students. Joining me now is public ethics professor at the Charles Sturt University and author Clive Hamilton. Clive, great to see you tonight. The Global Times, I wouldn't put it down in the same category as the New York Times or the Times of London, but the quote is that Australia is waging an intensifying espionage offensive against Australia. Do you buy that?
Well, no, but we need to understand what the Global Times is. It's the kind of nationalistic, sometimes hyper-nationalistic tabloid of the Chinese Communist Party media in Australia. And it sometimes is chosen to express the kind of threats and insulting language that the Communist Party leaders want to express, but don't want to put into their more mainstream, if I can say, journals like the People's Daily. I was particularly concerned with this Global Times report because it painted this picture of a massive program of espionage by the Australian government in China, which, quite frankly, is laughable. But more concerning is it seemed to be sending a very, very serious warning that Beijing is planning some kind of serious retaliation.
Well, Clive, what sort of game are they playing at the moment? We saw a survey that was done last week which showed that 92% of Australians find the Chinese to be untrustworthy. That figure was down about 26% on the last time they did that, back about 7 years ago. I mean, they just seem to be ramping up their rhetoric every day, whether it's trade sanctions, whether it's our attitude to trying to get to the bottom of what happened with coronavirus, whether it's Chinese students and education. I mean, every day we're now seeing an attack from Beijing.
It is extraordinary. Before the World Health Assembly agreed to follow Australia's suggestion and have an independent international inquiry into the origins of COVID-19, you could kind of see the logic of Beijing's threats, trying to dissuade Australia from pursuing this line. But after the world had agreed to have this inquiry, Beijing has actually ramped up the pressure and is now punishing Australia for our temerity, our unwillingness to bow to pressure from Beijing. And so there's no obvious demand from Beijing in the trade sanctions, the claims that Chinese people should avoid coming to Australia, including students and tourists, because Australians are so racist they're going to get beaten up on the streets, which is what the message that's been put out in China. And now there's this extraordinary allegation in the Global Times that we, Australia, are mounting this sinister campaign of espionage under the noses of the Chinese authorities. So this is getting very, very serious now, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if, in retaliation, as it were, against the raids by ASIO and the Australian Federal Police on Friday, I wouldn't be surprised if some innocent Australians in Beijing were dragged off the streets and charged with some extraordinary kind of allegation like espionage and banged up in jail with no prospect of release. I'm very worried about that.
I think we are entitled to be worried, and I think the whole nation's entitled to be worried because this rhetoric that they're ramping up is, as you say, is quite extraordinary. Just a quick one, Clive, without notice. Putin wants to be leader of Russia until 2036. He's handing out cars and holidays to people to get them involved and get them connected to the voting process. Is that good for the world, do you think?
Well, certainly not. And of course, it reminds us that President Xi Jinping had the People's Congress declare him effectively leader for life a year or so, or a couple of years ago. And so what we're seeing is strong men trying to establish themselves as dictators, establishing totalitarian states with complete control over information and political debate, developing a kind of cult of personality around them, militarizing and engaging in expansionist activity. Haven't we been here before? I mean, we really need to be very worried
Yeah.
about this kind of activity.